Well, good morning, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to the South East Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme annual partners meeting. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andy Crates. I'm the chair of the South East Coastal Group, and I'm going to be chairing the day. For those of you who don't know me, I work with one agency. I'm the area coastal engineer for Kent to South London area, and I've taken over from Brian Curtis as the chair for the South East Coastal Group. So before we start, I'm just going to say a few housekeeping tips. We're not expecting any fire alarms today, so if we do hear the alarm, it is for real. So it's straight through the fire exit over there and straight into the sea. For those of you who haven't found the toilets, they're through the doors there and along to the left. And today's meeting is a hybrid meeting, so we have people online, and we are going to be recording the meeting. There'll be tea and coffee available at the back there in the breaks, and then lunch will be served between 1 and 2 o'clock. So that's the housekeeping. So yeah, I'd like to welcome you to the King's Hall in Bay. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that we're having the partners meeting in the east of the monitoring programme area, because I'm not sure we've had it this far over before. So that's really good. I think for me, the programme is so important to us as coastal practitioners or managers. The programme has been running now for about 21 years, so which means we've got 21 years worth of data that on how our beaches are performing and reacting to storm events. And this data is absolutely critical to the development of coastal capital schemes, or probably more importantly, our beach management and beach management plans. The programme certainly continues to be supported by myself as the chair of the coastal group, but also the wider coastal groups. It's absolutely valuable that we continue to collect this data. But anyway, that's enough from me. We're going to go into our first session now. We've got 4 speakers that will take us up to 11 o'clock. We're going to be hearing from Thomas Dhoop, who's going to be giving us the coastal monitoring update. Annabella Ormerod, who's going to be talking about the South East Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme Asset Register. Unfortunately, Elizabeth can't be with us today, so Thomas is going to be giving us the Hydrodynamics update. And Samuel Pitman is going to be giving us updates to the Regional Coastal Monitoring website. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Thomas.
Thanks very much. I'm the program manager of the Channel Coastal Observatory. I won't be giving this talk just in my name. It's also in the name of Charlie Thompson, who's the director at CCO. And as every good presentation on coastal monitoring should, I'm going to start mine with what do I hope it works. Start with a picture of a long dead branch lost. This chapter is called Adaptation, and that's because I'm going to talk a lot about process over the next 20 minutes or so. Now, Hythe is one of the founding fathers of process philosophy. Hythe encourages us to think about things as dynamic, as sort of evolving, as emerging properties. Minutes or so. Now, Hythe is one of the founding fathers of process philosophy. Hythe encourages us to think about things as dynamic, as sort of evolving, as emerging properties. Process is essential to moving things forward, to getting things done, but it's also how we innovate, improve, and move things forward. Now, some would say that the reality of life is not a static state, but one of continuous change, flux, and evolution. And that's very much the environment in which CCO operates as well. At CCO, we do more than just measuring, analyzing, and reporting. We also strive to embrace change and continually improve on process. Now, process might sound quite boring. It's the mechanics behind the scenes, can be exciting, repetitive, invisible, but it's these unseen cumulative efforts of process that drives improved data deliverables, or at least that's what I'm going to try to convince you of over the next 18 minutes or so. All right, over the past 12 months at CCO, we've honed many of our processes. Some of the highlights: procurement and management of large-scale multi-beam surveys. Procurement can again be something that sounds quite boring, but it can also be an incredibly powerful tool to strive for innovations and efficiencies in your deliverables. So we're going to talk a bit about how we've introduced new procedures, new specifications to collect multi-beam surveys. Access to coastal defense asset information. We're having a big push out of the monitoring program to make the process of accessing information about coastal defenses much easier on a national scale. Tools to analyze beach behavior at scale. We've improved the process, we've smoothed out the process of how we do beach behavior analysis at long scale over a long time series, which supports the planning that we're doing for the next survey program between 27 and 33. Enhanced quality assurance of our wave buoys and introduction of in-house tides. We've introduced a new process in the quality control of our wave buoys to provide even more high quality wave data. And we've actually reintroduced an old process from the way that we predict our own tides now. And that is driving significant efficiencies in the program as well. But starting out with the classic, topographic surveys. The process by which we do our topographic surveys probably has changed quite a bit over the last 20 plus years that the program's been running. These days, 75% of the surveys across the region are done via GPS, 16% via a laser scanner mounted on an ATV, and 9% via UAV. You can see already that in the next couple of years, that percentage of UAV is just going to go up. Some basic statistics. As a program, we delivered 73 baselines, 82 profile surveys, and 16 call-offs over the last 12 months. Just a reminder, we are there to provide you with post-storm surveys. If you need any of those, just let us know, and we will accommodate for that. LiDAR. Last year, we've put a process in place that helps us immensely with the QC turnaround of our LiDAR. We did that through a bit of reorganization of resource within the team, and we're now able to turn around our LiDAR deliverables from Geomatics, who's the supplier that provides them to us on a 2-week basis. Over the winter of 23-24, we captured the western side of the Southeast Regional Coastal Monitoring Program. Geomatics delivered us with 39 batches. All of those have been quality controlled. That makes for a total of 558 square kilometers of LiDAR. And that will be available to you within the next couple of weeks. Over the winter, the coming winter, we'll be collecting LiDAR data very much in this patch on the eastern side of the monitoring program. We are in the process of delivering quite a large multi-beam bathymetry survey. It's about 82 square kilometers. And this is a good example of how, as CCO, we are having to change constantly, adapt to changing circumstances. We've gotten quite used to delivering these large-scale multi-beam bathymetry surveys in collaboration with the UKHO and the MCA. In fact, over the last decade, we've always delivered them via those two partners. But this time around, that wasn't an option. So that, to a certain extent, forced us to introduce new processes. We developed regional monitoring program specific specifications for the collection of multi-beam surveys. And we took advantage of that to make sure that the specifications are geared in particular towards coastal monitoring needs, not necessarily navigational needs, trying to achieve some efficiencies and cost there. Because we have new specifications, we have to develop new quality control procedures as well. And we're managing these contracts now fully, so some contract management procedures were necessary. I should add that in developing these processes, supported by the UKHO and the MCA, we should be very grateful for them to do so. Okay, this is the survey area that we're in the process of delivering down in the East Solent. And because we did our own tendering process, that added a lot of optionality to what we could do. So we went to tender with different options in there, and one of the most cost-effective options that we could do was to collect a part of the survey in-house with our own survey vessel, Cepha, with our new multi-beam system. So the stretch you can see there in the west between Hillhead, we then collected in-house. The data from that we can now see on the screen. That actually went really, really well. The data we collected is sort of order 1A standard. That's beneficial. We can't certify our own data. We're not the UKHO. But by collecting this in-house compared to the contracted option, we saved £37,000 on the program. The remainder of the area is in the process of being delivered by A2C, who won the contract. This area is just too far to go for Cepha. It would take us much too long to collect it ourselves. So we lose those efficiencies there as we go further afield. But all this collection will round up by the end of this calendar year. We're very much in the QC process and sort of deliverables process there. So by the end of this calendar year, all this data should be available. Sticking to bathymetry, the fact that we've now invested in providing these processes, developing them at CCO, is also helping our partners. An example is the multi-beam survey combined with single beam that was done at the Shingles Bank. That was delivered for BCP Council. Given that we've now gained sort of confidence in the system, using the system, we have processes and job of these things, we're able to pass on those efficiencies to our partners. And we're able to deliver this survey for only £5. Moving on to hydrodynamics. We're in the process of fleet rejuvenation of our hydrodynamic fleet of wave buoys. We're doing that so that our wave buoys stay in a healthy condition, so that they continue to measure the best possible quality of data, but also so that they don't become a cost center going forward due to negligence of maintenance. We have all the buoys reviewed for their physical capabilities. 11 out of 18 of our buoys need upgrading. 2 out of 11 have been upgraded, and we have another 6 more scheduled to be upgraded by the end of this financial year. Sticking to hydrodynamics, and this is something that I'll cover a bit more in depth in Lizzie's presentation, but we've introduced a new quality control process in our wave data QC. Basically, we've introduced something called the check factor. The check factor is a parameter that we monitor that is a measure of how well the wave buoy is following the waves, is loosely following the waves in the ocean. There could be a multitude of reasons of why a wave buoy would not be following the waves appropriately. There could be biofouling, weighing the buoy down. There could be physical intervention. A boat may have moored onto the buoy, or the mooring might be tangled with itself, or perhaps with a surface marker buoy. All of that can introduce ways that the wave buoy is not properly following the waves, and we can now use the check factor to monitor that. More detail. Updated tide predictions. So starting in 2024, tide predictions are derived using the Unified Tide Analysis Program. It's an open source program that we've sort of tuned to provide the best possible predictions for our tide gauges in the Southeast. Well, to be honest, in a national monitoring program. The harmonics that we get out of that program are updated on an annual basis, and we produce predictions from those every 2 years, and we do that on a rolling basis. By reintroducing our process, we also put in a new process to ensure the quality of the harmonics that we are deriving. We're doing that by comparing the high and low waters and the timings of those high and low waters between the predictions that we are deriving and the measured observations. We're also performing spectral analysis on the actual harmonic time series that we're getting to check whether there's any energy left on the constituent frequencies that we should be capturing, perhaps aren't fully capturing. And C, inspection of the residual time series themselves. You can see an example of that on the slide. The red line is the surge, is the residual. Are there any sort of frequently reoccurring in a systematic way components in there that highlight that we might have missed some of the harmonics of the time? Reintroducing that process is a way for us to sort of re-onboard skill, I guess you could say, a skill that has sort of waned over the last 10 years. But by producing them ourselves and not contracting them out again, we're achieving a cost efficiency of about £20,000 over the 6-year period of this phase. The asset register. Again, one of my highlights, as I mentioned at the top, we are having a big push in making coastal defence asset information more easily available nationally. This is something that Bella's going to cover in depth in the next presentation. I just wanted to highlight that the asset register is live. It has been launched. It's available on coastalmonitoring.org. Very much a click and point system. Please do go to the website, go to the asset register, click on any sea defense that you can see that is there. You will get some information about that sea defense. Try it out. If it doesn't work for you or we have any feedback, please do let us know. And we are very much still under development on this. But it's put some numbers on there as well, just to highlight how many assets we are currently making available. Along the southeast, over 8,000 assets have been included, and nationally, we're making information available on over 21,000 assets. Okay, we're also looking ahead, especially in the last couple of months. We've been doing a lot of looking ahead to what the next phase of the monitoring program might look like. The next phase will be between 2027 and 2033. The reason why we've been thinking so much about this the last couple of months is that the business case for phase 4 is in preparation. So a rough timeline for that is that it will be submitted by the end of 2025, which means that by the end of this calendar year, we need to have an idea of what the monitoring program between 27 and 33 is going to cost, which also means that we need to have an idea of what the survey regime is going to be between 27 and 33. As you probably all know, the way that we monitor the coastline at the monitoring program is via a risk-based approach. And that risk-based approach is underpinned by an empirical risk analysis and partner consultation, which is a process that we're going through right now. Sort of detailed that process on the slide, but I'm really just trying to fill white space. What I'm really trying to get onto, real quick, and striving for some process efficiencies. A big part of this process is doing the beach behavior analysis. That takes up a lot of time. This made more efficient the way that we do that beach behavior analysis. This is very much a repeat exercise of an analysis that was done back in 2014. In 2014, the data set that was used to study the beaches over the last 10 years and their behavior over the last 10 years were all CCO interim profiles. So it was limited to between Portland Bill and Salisbury Bill, essentially. The particular methodology applied and the tools to implement that, the SANS and Microsoft Excel. Now we're 2024. And in the analysis we've done today, we've included all profiles, all the way from Portland Bill, all the way to Gravesend. So it now fully covers the entire Southeast region. We've slightly adopted the method to facilitate more batch processing, and the tools we use now are custom MATLAB code. I can go into detail on this in the questions, more than happy to do so. But for now, real quick. What I want to highlight here is that by introducing small changes to the methodology to facilitate that batch processing that we're doing now, with limited information loss, it allows us to make a significant resource efficiency in doing that analysis. So we've analyzed many more profiles. We've covered the full region, but we've done it with 17 less working days than was needed in 2014, which resulted in a cost efficiency of about £4,200. That's accounting for inflation and the sort of increases. Again, sticking to the theme of looking forward, there might be a new process introduced in the program in the next phase in 27-30. From the NSERM Technical Advisory Group, the request has come down to provide cliff lines as part of the monitoring program to potentially feed into the NSERM engine. So in the budget for 27-33, we will include allocation to generate cliff lines from the LiDAR capture. If that ends up being funded, there will be cliff lines generated 3 times in the course of the next phase. Okay, so we've done some technical bits. Back to the more procurement side of things. We are trying to ensure a competitive environment for contracted works as well. We've put quite a bit of effort into that over the last year. We've promoted our procurement framework at trade fairs such as Oceanology. We've actually exhibited with our own stand at GeoBusiness this year at the Excel in London, all with the intention of reaching a wide spectrum of contractors that could potentially work for us, but are not currently on our framework yet. But we would really like to onboard so that we have as much competition as possible for contracts in the next phase. All of that is going to culminate in a contractor day that we're organizing at the NOC. That's taking place in 5 weeks, I think. We have about 45 contractors attending, 48, sorry, contractors attending at the moment. And again, the idea is very much to get everybody in a room and convince them that we are a good client. Okay, so I've talked a lot about process. I hope I've convinced you ever so slightly that it's sometimes useful to listen to Holly every once in a while, reminding us about process and the importance of process. At CCO, we don't view processes as fixed, but as constantly evolving. We believe that smarter processes lead to better outcomes. Try to support that with some of these examples. Procurement and management of large-scale multi-beam surveys save about £37,000 by basically amending our procurement program there and collecting some of that in-house. Access to coastal defence asset information, launching the asset register has made the process of accessing that information for our users much, much easier. Tools to analyze beach behavior at scale, making small tweaks to the way that we do technical things can sometimes lead to really big cost efficiencies without losing much information. Enhanced quality assurance of our wave buoys and introduction of in-house type predictions. Again, tilting in a new process to ensure even better quality from the data from our wave buoys, while at the same time to re-onboarding a skill that had waned. Again, it's driving efficiencies to the tune of about £20,000 over the last 6 years in the case of clients. So process, it's very important. It's easier. Thanks.
Should be better. My name's Ormerod. I'm a coastal process scientist at Coastal Observatory, and I'm the project manager for the South East Coastal Defence Asset Register. So last year we got the exciting news that we had a pilot of the asset register live on the website, and this year we have big upgrades. So we have a national asset register available now. We have all the local authority and environment agency information for the North East region, East Riding and the South West. In the South East, we have all the local authority information that we have so far, as well as the EA information. In the Anglian region, we have EA information, and in the North West, we have the EA information in the database, but not yet live. We also have a pilot of the 3D viewer available. So this is just holding 4 sites at the moment, and it's a way that users can then preview and then download point cloud data, which we didn't previously enable. This is stored within the asset register itself. We're very much sort of looking for feedback at the moment, so please do take a look. Looking at the South East in particular, we now have 9,600 odd inspections of 8,000 assets. However, a lot of these are EA assets. So when we look at the local authority ones in particular, you can see it's a lot less. We have about 3,800 inspections of about 2,300 assets. And clearly there's some really large gaps in here. A lot of these gaps can't necessarily be accounted for by just EA assets. Some of them we can account for now in that we have confirmation that, for example, a local authority may not hold information on that asset. And knowing that, we can now make a plan to move forward from there. However, for a lot of these places, we also still don't have the knowledge of what information is there. So to look at that in a bit more detail, we can look at it across the whole region. Our green areas, we don't necessarily have data for, we have the knowledge of what's there. As we go towards the sort of lighter greens, it's that we have a timeline for delivery of that data. And then those oranges and reds are, again, areas that we aren't sure of what's available. If we look at the data itself, it's obviously a slightly different picture. So our greens here are T98 standard inspections. The lighter ones just sort of where they're very old, so maybe about 10 years old. As we're getting into the oranges, we're talking areas with no inspections or where we have inspections to no known standard. And then the reds, again, we have no knowledge of what's happening. We can then combine that together and get a bit more of an overview picture. So we have our greens, which are, we sort of know what's there and we know it's to a T98 standard. Getting into our oranges, we know what's there and it's the no inspections or there's inspections to no known standard. And then again, those dark oranges and reds, we don't know what's happening there. Clearly, you can see there's a lot more sort of lighter orange in the eastern end, and that light orange is where we're sort of focusing our interest. This is where we have confirmation of what's happening and the things that we can do about it in that area. So we are going to be going out to tender for asset inspections, hopefully in the next few weeks, to try and fill some of those gaps that are there. These are just for assets where we don't have that baseline information, so we don't really hold any knowledge of the condition of the asset. There will be a few sort of repeats of particular features that we do have inspections for, but we want to make sure we have a baseline for an area or, for example, to complete a growing field. These will be happening over the winter and spring of early 2025. And sort of everyone that's associated with this should be aware, so this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. This does, of course, raise the question of why are we doing this now when we could have potentially done this 2 years ago and now be potentially doing our second round of this. So to answer that, we can look at what we know now compared to what we knew 2 years ago. So as a reminder, in the early stage of the project in 2022, we spoke to as many of the local authorities as we could to try and understand what data was held, if that was available for us to access, what we might need to provide in order to facilitate that access. So we asked if basic information held on the assets, and of 19 authorities, 17 said yes and 2 said no. Now we know that, granted, this is of 20, the numbers are small, 12 said yes, and 3 we can say definitely don't. 5, again, we are unsure about what's happening. We also asked how frequently are assets inspected. 2 years ago, every local authority we spoke to told us that they inspect assets at least every 2 years. 9 told us that they inspect every year, 6 twice a year, and some even more frequently than that. We can confirm now that 3 inspect every year, 1 every other year. 6 have at some point done a one-off inspection, and this was generally between 2014 and 2018. And again, 5, we can't account for what's happening. So the question is, how do we move on from this with the new information that we have? We're clearly going to have to change the approach that we've taken. We're going to focus in 3 key areas. We're going to focus on improved communication between all coastal practitioners who work on anything relating to assets. We're going to focus on the standard to which assets are inspected. And we're going to focus on the management of data relating to assets. So to start with the communication, first and foremost, very simply, of course, CCO exists to operate on behalf of local authorities. So we would always encourage everyone to make use of the resources that we have available. And secondly, we've seen a lot of sort of duplications between EA and local authority inspections. Clearly, like as a principle, this is not a problem. But what we're seeing here is where we see the start of the problem. So here, the red line is an EA inspection, the blue line is a local authority inspection. Even if you ignore sort of differences in the digitization, what we're seeing is where, for example, an inspector has split, say, a seawall into separate lengths for the inspection. Another organisation coming in has split that seawall into different lengths sections in different areas. So now those inspections are incomparable. We can't remove this duplication, and suddenly our data set becomes a lot less useful. When we're talking about inspection standards, we're of course talking about T98 standard. This is the industry standard, even if it wasn't used in the past. It is what's used now, and it is what will be used in the future. It's important to understand the T98 standard, even if you're not necessarily carrying out the inspection itself, because it's important to understand how it relates to data standards, how it relates to industry standard terminology, and also how it relates to the different types of data sets that we handle. For example, making sure that when we talk about an asset inspection, we're talking about something that is different to, for example, a beach survey, even if that beach survey may go over the sea defence at the back of the beach. So 2 years ago, we provided T98 training to 40 delegates from across 17 local authorities. And we hope that that information is continuing to be used. Anyone that took that course will know that the OBCAM document is one that goes hand in hand with T98 inspection. This has been updated since those courses were run 2 years ago, and there is another version due to be released very soon. If you don't have a copy of this or would like an updated copy, you can always email OBCAM, the Environment Agency, and get a copy. Another useful resource is the Data Requirements Library. So this is effectively the back end of AIMS, but it includes a lot of useful information about terminology and definitions, and sort of list of accepted asset types and materials and things like that. It's a useful reference guide, and that's all available online. And finally, the EA are releasing a new best practice documentation very soon, so we'd always encourage everyone to familiarise yourself with that. Data management. This certainly takes sort of two main approaches. We're talking the mapping of assets, which is one of tasks that are very important, and making sure everything has an ID number. So, for example, here on the left, you can see we have two lines indicating the seawall. They're both labelled wall. Neither of them are directly on a feature. It's unclear whether this is a duplication of an inspection of a wall, or whether one is an inspection of the sort of front of the seawall and one is the sort of splash wall at the back. Now, I'm sure I could ask the engineer for this area and they could tell me very quickly the answer to my question. But what happens if, for example, we're looking at an inspection that's now 5-6 years old and that engineer has long since moved on? I'm very confident that whoever took over wouldn't have been told that detail in a handover. So now we have to question whether we can really apply that information to what we see on the ground, because we don't fully know what it's referring to. Similarly, with the ID numbers, we're not necessarily talking a complex ID system, just the numbers 1 to 10 works. For example, here you can see a list of groins, all just with a different number next to them. It sounds simple, but we sort of see a lot of inspections come in that might have 10, 20 groins in the groin field, all with very nice conditions, good inspections, and they're all just labelled groin. And we have no way of relating that to what's on the ground. I can't really believe that anyone sort of using that inspection can do that either. So suddenly, has that inspection lost meaning? Was it worth even doing in the first place? So ultimately, clearly there's some work to do, probably across the board. A lot of that work we can facilitate ourselves, but obviously we can't do it all alone because we're not necessarily the ones applying it. But it's really important stuff that he's doing to really improve efficiencies, remove duplication of effort, and get us out of this sort of hole that we're trying to reinvent the wheel every year or two at the moment. To completely change the subject, before I finish, we've had a lot of questions on the EA FSERM Data Strategy project. This is not our project, so I can't speak for them, but I have some information that I can share. So firstly, this project was always vaguely on the cards. It's one of the main reasons that we made sure to follow sort of national data standards in the asset register. Perhaps we didn't expect it to come around in quite the form it did, but it was always due to come around in some way. The project has multiple stages to it. Some are complete, some are still ongoing, some yet to come. So the ones that are complete are a desk study was carried out to identify the status of asset information in the country. Unfortunately, this desk study failed to identify the monitoring programme as a whole, and so failed to identify the asset register and led to some rather confusing communication to everyone that knew about the asset register. Then a series of workshops held with RMAs. I'm sure a lot of people here attended. These were really useful and meant that everyone could actually communicate the work they're doing, including ourselves, and they could get a better picture of what's really happening. Based on those workshops, we were able to establish now a new technical steering group between sort of asset leads within EA National and within the National Monitoring Programme. So we now have quarterly, so we can actually discuss the work that we're doing and how we can work together and improve efficiency that way. Some other side bits that are going on from this project are there are updates to the DRL to improve the alignment between AIMS and OPCAM. And there's also the new good practice documentation, which should be released soon. And then the big bit is the data sharing platform for both the coastal and fluvial data. It has been decided now that the coastal data will be ingested directly from the RCMP asset register. So you wouldn't necessarily have to do anything on that part. And we have requested that it's expressed a bit more clearly in the future. Flood data, of course, will still come from the RMAs. But the planning stage of the project is still very much in the works, so things may change in the future. That's before I continue, because guys. Yeah, that's it live on the website. I've been really it's on a separate map viewer to main data. And if you haven't had it, and get in touch if you have any issues with it.
See, I am not Lizzie. Unfortunately, Lizzie couldn't be here today due to a family emergency, so I'll be giving a presentation. It's a good coastal modelling presentation, though it doesn't start with a dead French philosopher, so that's a little mock on it. But I'll do my best to convey what Lizzie wanted to say today. A couple of new deployments in the National Hydrodynamic Program. We have a new waypoint at Spurn Point, which is part of the Humber strategy. We also have a new tide gauge, I guess you could say, at West Bay Harbour. That's replacing an Andromeda and a single pressure transducer that has been installed there for quite some time. The dual pressure transducer is a unique system within the monitoring program. It's been custom designed for that location and hopefully will provide some really good quality data for us there. And then very locally, you can practically see it when you just look out the window. In front is the new Wave Radar Rex 2 that's been installed at Herne Bay that also replaced the Andromeda step gauge that was installed there. The reason why the Andromeda is coming out is because they are no longer manufactured and no longer supported by the company that used to make them in the Netherlands. They have batteries in them, but a finite use life, so they cannot be replaced afterwards. They are moving to the Rex 2 system in those places. We also had some adrift events over the last year. The Rustington Wave Buoy went adrift in November of 2023. It took a little while to recover the Rustington Wave Buoy due to weather conditions. Essentially, it was not safe to go and collect it until about 3 days later, I believe. And in that time period, the buoy drifted about 26 kilometers east of from where it was deployed. And the Healing Island Wave Buoy got hit by a sailing vessel, which then entangled in it. The buoy had to be cut loose in order to free that vessel by the RNLI, but the buoy was then quickly dragged into the harbour by the harbour master there. So all is well that ends well. Something that I touched on in the program updates, one of the advances that we've introduced in control. So last year, if you saw this presentation, we focused on the breaking waves work that we did. We introduced a new QC process for breaking waves, which allows us to recover a lot of information that was previously QC'd out. That work is about to be published in the ICE Proceedings Maritime Engineering, so look out for that. But this year, we're going to talk about the check factor. Like I said, the check factor is a measure of how well the buoys measure the sea state, or follow the sea state, essentially. And it's actually fairly simple. It's just derived from a ratio. Waves should, in theory, in deep water, make circular motions as they're following the sea state. But as something intervenes with that motion, that could just be the seabed or intervention at the site, that ratio will start to change. That circle will become more horizontal or stretch in some other way. I think that's just someone else. Of what can actually happen or what can actually drive some of that non-circular motion of the buoy, some of that hindrance to the movement of the buoy. On the left-hand side, you can see lobster pots that have been attached to the mooring of one of our wave buoys. In the middle, this is highlighted, right? Because you're not supposed to moor on our buoys, but sometimes boats do, and we can see that in the data. And on the right-hand side, you can see a severely biofouled wave buoy. Now, we go and service them every 6 months, so typically the biofouling is not that much of an issue, but we can sometimes see excessive muscle growth on some of our moorings, and that will introduce significant amounts of weight to the wave buoy that will again affect the data quality that we derive. Okay, so here's the basic principle behind the check factor. It's a parameter that we can monitor just like a chest or TP or wave direction. And the parameter basically looks at the horizontal displacement and the vertical displacement and the ratio between those two. So in theory, if our wave buoy is making perfect circles and deep water and good sea states, then we should have a check factor of 1. That's height of 2 meters, wavelength of 2 meters, we get a perfect ratio of 1. We click again. Then those circles start to deform as sort of external factors get introduced to the buoy. So we can get the formation in sort of in the elongated way as sort of an ellipse up and down. That will give us a check factor of about 0.3 because we're now having a ratio of 1.3. And in the other way, 3/1, our check factor goes to 3. So again, we are striving for 1, that is the perfect sea state, If it starts to deviate significantly from that, something is causing the buoy to not make good circles within the way we see it. Okay. Things are always more complex in reality, though. So in reality, when we plot the check factor, this is what we are looking at to monitor it. The dotted line there is 1, so that's our perfect ratio. And you can see a lot of the wiggly lines are actually around there. It'll never be straight on there because we deploy in shallow water, so we don't deploy in ideal conditions. And you can see some of it, there's one line that's pretty high removed there. The different lines indicate the different frequencies from the buoy. So as you know, a wave buoy doesn't just measure one set of waves, it measures multiple sets of waves all the time. We'll have short period waves, long period waves, we'll have waves coming from different directions, and all that can get parsed sort of out of each other with spectral analysis. And we can sort of see where the periods of the different waves are that we are measuring at the buoy. And that's very much what's reflected here in this figure as well. It's the check factor measured at different frequencies of different wave fields that are coming to the buoy. So the recent example of the check factor in practice. So this is the Scarborough wave buoy up in the northeast, which got severely tangled with its own surface marker mooring, which caused the wave buoy to not measure proper waves at all. So you can see here in the actual data time series from the Scarborough wave buoy that we don't actually see anything, particularly in the statistically derived wave parameters from that buoy. Although you can clearly see in a previous slide, it's very much tangled. It's not really doing anymore what it's supposed to do. It's still pretty hard to identify that just from looking at wave height or wave period. Now you can see a couple of spikes there in wave period, but spikes are not necessarily uncommon when we look at our wave buoys. So those spikes wouldn't necessarily cause any alarm bells immediately. But now that we have a check factor, you can clearly see something went very wrong there about 2 weeks period prior to its service, which is indicated with that star. We click again with the line. Yeah, so what the check factor now allows us to do, it allows us to identify that there is a problem at site. The buoy is no longer performing well physically inside the waves. That could be a problem with the buoy. It could be something that's been externally introduced to the buoy. And we can also identify at which point in time did things actually go wrong. So we can introduce that into our quality control process so we can accurately flag the data that is potentially inaccurate. Check factor in practice. So we have here variations between sites due to different buoy depths and tidal ranges. So those wiggly lines I showed you around the dotted line, that was 1, the way that we monitor it. Those sorts of lines will appear at different places within that variety, depending on how much water we have underneath the buoy, essentially. What we're really looking for when we monitor the check factor is sort of typical breaks in slope, I should say. So it's really large deviations from that particular standard baseline or what we typically see at a buoy, which is what Lizzie writes as her next point. Understanding of the baseline check factor, you can see when it departs from the expected values. So at each wave buoy, we will have identified what is sort of the baseline of those frequencies that we want to see and where does it actually start deviating from it in order to have an intervention. The check factor provides us with some reassurance as well. We have a service interval of 6 months. During those 6 months, our buoys do get biofoul. There was a picture of that a couple of slides ago. But we can now see in the check factor as sort of a point of reassurance that at least that amount of biofouling that we get after 6 months does not interfere with the measurements of the buoy. It's also a real-time QC check on the buoy's status. Again, it can alert us when we have to send the contractor out to go and pay a visit to the buoy. That was it. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Just before I start, I'm going to make a little change because I've been watching online and helping out over there, and there's a filter on the back of the camera that keeps blocking out the speaker, so I'm going to just turn that off. Anyway, hello, I'm Sam Pitman. I'm a GIS analyst at the Channel Coast Observatory. I'm going to briefly take you through the updates to the website over the last year since it last 8 p.m. Here we go. I'm going to start you off with a big page of numbers. I'm sure you're all going to enjoy that. But yeah, this is a quick overview of the website uploads that we've had in the last year. So on the left, you can see national website uploads, and on the right, you can see the Southeast. So just some interesting stats from that. We've had over 20,000 new files uploaded to the website in the last year, with over 12,000 of those being in the southeast. Some interesting stats: over 50 gigabytes of aerial photography, over 9 gigabytes of topographic data, over 7 gigabytes of LiDAR data. And then some amazing stats for the real-time data as well: over 4,000 days of wave data uploaded to the real-time pages. So yeah, as Bella's touched on already, and Thomas, the big new addition to the website in the last year is the asset register. I'll just take you through that a little bit more, just to really drill it in that it's a great new feature. So here you can see the asset viewer. As Bella said, you can access this through the map viewer and data catalog. There's a little link at the top left that says asset register, and then click this page. All the green dots on there are basically different assets. So if we zoom in on an area, thank you. If we zoom in on an area, here's Bournemouth, for example. You can use the query tool like you would in the normal map viewer to select any of the different assets, and then it will bring up some information about that asset and also give you the option to download that asset information. Also, like on the map viewer and data catalog, you can create a selection and download all the assets within that selection. And click. Thank you. So also, as Bella said, part of this is that we've introduced a 3D viewer. This is something that's been discussed for quite a long time, because we've got a lot of point cloud data that we hold. We thought a great way to introduce this to the website was through the asset register, as we have asset scans that haven't previously been shared on the website. So if we look at the next slide, you can see that in the asset viewer, you can go on the data layers and you can select the scan viewer. Then if you query any of these scans, you can see the little red squares on the screen there. It will bring up a text box, and then in that you can click on the data viewer. So if we have a look at the data viewer itself, you can see there's one of our point clouds. This is an asset scan of Swanage, and basically we've got a web-based asset viewer. If we look at what that's using, you can see that it's using the Cesium platform, which is basically, as I said, a web-based point cloud viewer. So if you open this up in the web viewer, it's all basically navigatable with your mouse or your touchscreen. So you can zoom in, you can pan around, you can rotate the view, all in real time, which is a pretty cool feature. But also, if you click on those scans, not only can you view the scan data, you can also download the LAS files. So there's also a way to make those available. We started off with a few assets. We're planning to load more of these over the next year. And then the long-term plan for the 3D viewer and 3D data sharing is that we'll add it to the main map viewer and data catalog as well, and make some of the other LAS files that we have available to our partners. So yes, there's also a number of other changes that I'm going to rattle through now. So the first of these is that we've got new navigation buttons on the real-time pages. In the top left, there's links to each of the different data tables. So wave type, met, and GPS data. That will just basically take down the page to that specific section. So for new users of our website, it just makes it a bit more accessible. And for people who've been using the website for a long time, you can just click on that and it basically speeds up the workflow. There's also the other buttons you can see on the top right, which turn on and off the different point types on the map viewer. So you can look at your wavebuoy, tide gauges, and met stations. Thank you. We've also updated how the map viewer selection and zoom works. With the introduction of the asset register and a separate map viewer, we've ensured that you can carry your selection and your zoom extent between the two map viewers. So if we look at this example, you can create a selection, and then as you flick between the two, it will maintain that selection and the zoom extent, which is really useful because if you were looking at downloading a specific set of assets, you could also then download the associated data for that area. So you could get the OS tiles for the aerial photography and LiDAR, as well as the topographic data. Another change that we've made to the website is that we've got a reset zoom button. So at the bottom of the map viewer and the asset viewer, there's a little button that says reset zoom, and that would basically take you back to the starting zoom, which is a nice feature just if you get a bit lost, or if you come back to the website and it's not where you expect it to be. We've also made a couple of changes to the API. Next and previous high and low water has been added to all water level observations in the API. And we've also created a new API endpoint for tide predictions, meaning that you can query future dates for the prediction period that we have on the website. Another change that we've made is a couple of updates to the resources page. So alongside the asset register, we've now got the live asset register glossary, which gives a description of the different things in the asset register, basically, which is just really useful for people that are using that for the first time. We've also got a gravel coast section, which compiles research about gravel coasts into one useful spot. An exciting part about the gravel coast section specifically is that part of that is a community blog, allowing the researchers involved in the project to post directly on the website. We've also got blog functionality on the website, which we may end up using elsewhere, which is quite exciting as well. So as always, keep your eye out over the next year for new features, because I'm sure we'll add more things. And the easiest way to do this is by following us on Twitter or X @Channel Coast, and also to sign up to our quarterly newsletter, because whenever we make an update to the website, we'll also publish an article explaining what that update is and how to use it. Yeah, and then if you've got any questions, feel free to ask me or email in samuel.pitman@sort.ac.uk or the CCO email. I get all of those as well. And as has been previously mentioned, we've also got a feedback button on the website. So if you have any feedback, positive, negative, or any suggestions, please do let us know. We always appreciate it. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, please ask away, and that goes for everyone online as well. Please type them in the chat.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the presentations. So we're now going to open up the floor to questions for people online and in the room. Any questions? Claire?
What's the time frame for the delivery of the external data collection for assets, and how long do you think that would be?
So we're looking at a completion of inspection and related delivery by sort of summer next year. So probably making that available to local authorities in sort of July, August 2025.
Any other questions? Online?
Nothing online.
Wow. I guess I've got a question regarding the asset register. So let's just say for Environment Agency assets, they're inspected twice a year for coastal assets. As they're inspected, will them inspections get forwarded to you to be updated? So I guess how often is the asset register updated?
So we're accessing the EA inspections via the API. We don't automatically get updates for that, but it would essentially be if they're on a 6-monthly system, then every sort of 6 months we would pull down.
Okay, so yeah, okay. So,
yeah, continually checking really.
Yeah.
Fiction.
Well, credit to the presenters, you must have answered everyone's questions. So I guess we'll go into if there's no further questions, we'll break for coffee then. Okay. Okay, so we'll break now and we'll be back at 11:30. Bit more. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. And we're now going to go into that second section of the day. And we're going to be inviting Simon Beal and Liam Wooltorton up to the to present. Simon's going to be presenting on the Hythe Ranges Sea Defence Scheme, and Liam is going to be presenting on the Asset and Adaptation Plan. Simon.
Thank you, Andy. So, yeah, just get to a few words about the Hythe Ranges scheme. So, it's completed in 21, took a year to build. The drivers for the scheme was our focusing strategy, which is providing 1 in 200% protection for the communities of the marsh, Romney Marsh and Walland Marsh. There's also hold the line at that particular spot. Obviously, we would like to have managed rear line, but Hythe Ranges is a very important asset for the MOD. That's where they do a lot of their small arms training, particularly important at the moment because they're training Ukrainian troops. So the MOD contributed to the cost of the scheme, which was about 26 million. Before the scheme, we had a failing groin field. Very little shingle. It hadn't been maintained for a long time. There was, we estimate 1 in 20 standard protection, regular overtopping, which wasn't an issue for us for FCRM because it's a long way from residential properties, but it was a nuisance to the MOD. Obviously, if their ranges are flooded, they can't operate it. Hence why they contributed to the scheme, and we held the line. There was also there's a building there called the Grand Redoubt, which was in the Napoleonic fort. It was also used in the Second World War and the First World War as a gun emplacement. That's a scheduled ancient monument, and it had a rockcrete revetment, which was a constant nuisance to us. Every time we had a blow, it used to blow out the rock, and we had to go and repair it. So that was one of the scheme objectives, to make that more resilient as well. So, as I said, it's partnership funded with the MOD. It was the 1 in 200 standard protection up to 2070. 23 new timber groins were installed. 7 of the existing were deemed in a fit enough state to refurbish. New rock revetment around the Grand Redoubt, and 300,000 cube single recharge. We go on to the overview. You can't see it like that, but just so at the western end is the Grand Redoubt. Then you have your groin field, and towards the east, there are some Martello Towers, 3 Martello Towers, which pinch the beach a bit later. Then that runs into Fisherman's Beach, which is maintained by folks in Hythe District Council. So the whole of our scheme was contained within the Hythe Ranges footprint. Defence sections. So A is the rock revetment, B is the body of the groin field, which has a gradient of a profile of about 1 in 9. C is where the beach is pinched a little bit because of those Martello Towers, and also because it's on the curve, more on the curve. So the gradient there is 1 in 7, which has caused us some problems. I'll go on a bit later. And then at D, you have an existing rock revetment, which provides this required standard protection. And E is Fisherman's Beach, which rolls into the bosun's elements. Right. So the groins are constructed using sustainably sourced green heart. That came from West Africa. 35,000 tonne of rock from Norway. 3 to 6 tonne individual rock sizes. Shingle was harvested from area 461. If memory serves correctly, I think that's around the Channel Islands. So that was harvested by the Vox Amelia and then pumped ashore by a sinker line. We also experimented with low concrete. There's a pedestrian path which the MOD used, which we laid in concrete using this chem-free stuff, which basically is uses the leftovers from the iron smelting industries. And we also used composite rebar. The guys used it, didn't like it. It was very difficult to work, but once it's down, it seems to be fulfilling the similar function to traditional cement-based concrete. So we'll be monitoring that over time, and if that is a success and that we've rolled out elsewhere as part of our carbon saving initiatives. So constraints, I've mentioned the Martello Towers. One of them is a scheduled monument and the other two are listed. I don't know the different, why they've got different grades of protection. They did influence the design because they pinched the beach. As I say, the beach there is a little bit steeper than we would otherwise have liked. The ground redoubt is a scheduled ancient monument. The seabed from the barge to the beach where the single line was deployed is fished commercially. So we had to liaise quite closely with the fishing communities and some compensation payments were made. The ranges themselves are incredibly busy. Fortunately, because they're a stakeholder and such an important stakeholder in the scheme, they worked very closely with us and we had a very good relationship. So they would give us areas where they would suspend firing so that we could carry out the works. But obviously, it still is a very real constraint. The foreshore is accessible to the public as well. On non-firing days, the MOD publishes a timetable which the public have access to. And generally, most weekends are non-firing. So the public will be there. And obviously, because of the scheme and the time constraints, we were working at weekends, so we had to manage that public interface. There is protected vegetation growing within the shingle, both pre and post scheme. That was managed very effectively with Natural England, who were very helpful to us. They allowed us to translocate some of it, so we get access onto the foreshore. The Hythe Range itself is a local wildlife site, which didn't really infect the scheme per se, but obviously you had to be careful where we sited our site compound and routes for vehicles to the winter site. The part of the frontage, I think it's the western, no, beg your pardon, the eastern part of the frontage is a SPA. I think the designated feature is feeding opportunities for terns. So provided we weren't carrying out too many operations during the breeding season, which is early summer, we was okay with that. So that was reasonably easy to manage. Learning experiences. So I've mentioned that the frontage is a public access area. Where we put the rock revetment around the ground redoubts, which was at the east of the frontage, it allows only a very limited window of opportunity to walk along the toe of the revetment, so to continue along the frontage. So people that are coming in from Dymchurch have a very limited window to get through to the ranges, and people that are walking from the east are quite likely to get to the revetment and find they can't proceed any further, so they become trapped by the incoming tide. So the PSRA assessment deemed that the last bay, the first bay from the east to be precise, was the designated exit point. So they would come up the beach to a muster point, which was under the nose of a watchtower the MOD maintained. That watchtower is there to make sure that people don't wander onto the ranges during firing times, but it's also remotely monitored 24/7. So they would then see that some muster point, collect them, and take them to a point of safety. The problem was that, as you guys have probably experienced many times, when you have a hard defence that transitions into a soft defence, you get heavy erosion. So that first bay is subject to aggressive erosion, which forms some modest cliffing. So people trying to climb up it, it's difficult. So we went to the designers and asked them for a solution, and they come back with a traditional green heart set of steps, as you would see over a rock revetment, perhaps elsewhere. Tremendously expensive. I think not short, my far short of £1 million. So we went to our friends at ECAP, and they designed us the solution, which you can see here. You can see it very well. But basically, it's a bump anyway. So it's very little used. We can evidence that actually, since the scheme was finished, it's never been used. So it's an appropriate risk management response in this instance, we feel. Somebody can use the rope to help pull themselves up the beach. It's not a polypropylene rope, it's a Kevlar rope, so it's very resistant, should last quite a long time. The other learning experience perhaps is, as I alluded to earlier, section C, the section in front of Martello Towers is quite steep and it doesn't hold the shingle very well. It's not too much of a problem. We'll go in once a year to recycle it, but we only have a very limited recycling because of the MOD's firing timetable. And it's basically the Christmas shutdown, so it's a small window. Ideally, I think if we was to revisit the design, we'd have perhaps gone for a rock revetment in that particular area. But as I say, it's not the end of the world, it's easy to manage. I don't think there's much else that I can add on the experiences. Too early to say about the chem-free stuff. We are monitoring it. The plan is to go back after, I think, 2 or 3 years to take some core samples and see how it's performing and generally visually monitor it. There were some opportunities to do some ecological enhancements as part of the scheme as well. One was a timber trough that was several that were attached to the groins, like window boxes. And the idea was that they would perform some habitat in the inside of the range. And also, I think Mackley's, I should have mentioned, but Mackley's were the contractor, the TBO scheme. Mackley's come up with a very novel idea of using a rasp on the end of a machine, which is basically like the sort of instrument they use to dig tunnels, one on a smaller scale, about 1 metre across, and actually ground bowl-shaped depressions in some of the rocks. And they have now formed as rock pools. And we've had those analysed as part of the scheme over the last 2 or 3 years. And they are being used by fish and invertebrates and all sorts of stuff. So that's been a success and something that we probably like to replicate elsewhere. So I think that's it for me. Are we doing questions or? I would do it, yeah. At the end. Excellent. So more time for Liam. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Liam Wooltorton, Head of Engineering at Canterbury City Council. I'm going to introduce our assets and adaptation plans, and Andy Stevens of AJS Flood Risk Consulting is going to talk about how we use data from the Coastal Monitoring Programme, to develop the plans. So the idea of the AMPs, they started when we met the Environment Agency. It was in February 2022. It was actually here at King's Hall, and we met them to discuss Canterbury's FCERM capital programme. So we were keen on producing a study that looks at the standard of protection and the condition of our existing assets, and then considers, how this will change over the next 100 years. So the plans consider options for managing flood risk over the 100-year appraisal period, appraising the best time for capital works and adaptation. So this will include beach management, beach replenishment, new timber groins, rock structures, raising the rear, seawall, and upgrades to our floodgates. So we now have a comprehensive strategy for works that will be used to inform the EA's capital programme, but also guide us and support our FCERM business case submissions to the Environment Agency. Next slide. So the plans provide an update of the previous suitable strategy and the Herne-based draft strategy. As part of the works, we also developed a new overtopping tool, which Andy talked more about. The AAPs, they use the latest UKCP and EA predictions. We want our plans to use adaptive pathways. We don't want to, we want our plans to be adaptable to uncertainties and not commit ourselves to any particular intervention or management system. So I'm delighted to say that we now have assets and adaptation plans for both Whitstable and Herne Bay that have been signed off by the Environment Agency in August. So the presentation by us today, it will be towards the Herne Bay plan, given that we're here in sunny Herne Bay. I think it might be sunny outside, I'm sure. And it was also the latter of the two AAPs that we worked on. So the data provided by the monitoring programme is absolutely invaluable in developing these plans. So anyway, I'm now going to hand over to Andy and he will explain how we use the coastal monitoring data within our AAPs.
Ben, the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm going to give a brief overview. Ben's already mostly done it of what the assets and adaptation plans are. Then I'm going to talk about how the coastal monitoring data was used, which is the main point of it. And then I'm going to go through the methodology, some of the results, and then what the next steps are. Yeah, so Lynn's sort of giving the overview. Essentially, it's a 100-year strategy with a focus on sort of being adaptable. So with that in mind, sort of traditionally with appraisals, you look at the current year, year 20, year 50, year 100. It's just sort of format that's developed. Sometimes you call it sort of short, medium, long term. But we've done our modelling and our thinking at 10-year epochs instead. We picked 10 years because it's still achievable because there's 11 epochs in total, but it sort of gives it a lot more detail. And things like replenishments are often done on a sort of 10 to 15 year timescales, sort of ties in. Yes, so the option appraiser includes trigger levels. So although we have, for the purposes of costing and economics, we've come up with what management we think we do over a 100-year period. All of those actual interventions on the ground will be linked to trigger levels. So trigger levels might include a beach reaching a certain certain size, whether that's volume or cross section. It might be asset inspection showing a certain condition grade for defences and other things like that. Next slide, please. Yes, so coastal monitoring data. I think we've used most of what you offer. It does predate the asset register, but that would have been really handy. But then working with Canterbury on it, having access to their asset data was really, really invaluable. So I think there's a lot to that asset register you got will be really helpful because it is amazing when you start a new project, not having access to the good data. If you're not careful, you can start going down the modelling route using data that's not perhaps fit for purpose, and then all of your modelling doesn't really mean an awful lot. Yeah, so topographic data. So we use both the volumetric data, which is used for sort of the long-term beach change modelling, but we also use the profile data, which I'll go on to a little bit in the next slide. And the aerial photography is really, really handy, both for mapping, but also for sort of doing some spatial analysis. So actually, when you're mapping out where groins are, where sea walls are, that sort of thing, and especially for overtopping, working out exactly where your beach profile meets the hard defence. That stuff's invaluable. So actually, the aerial's really, really handy. Wave and water level data was used a little bit. The main inputs, which I'll go into, came off the back of a study CCO did for us back in 2012. But the wave and water level data is quite a good sense check for the overtopping. You can actually look at sort of wave and water levels we've had and actually just sense check, are the values you're using reasonable? And then finally, in the recycling log data that you keep, when you're working out annual beach change, if you're not obviously discounting artificial movements of sediment, then you're going to get your values all wrong. Next slide, please. Yeah, so profile analysis. So for the purpose of this, developed a new spreadsheet-based tool, which just takes out some of the time But the tool basically is fed into assumptions which have grown over time. So the assumptions are things like, when does a berm slope become a beach slope? So is that a 1 in 10 slope? Is that a 1 in 11, 1 in 11, etc. But what it came out with is this. So you input the profile data from the monitoring program, and it will tell you how long the berm is, where that elevation is. It'll tell you the beach slope, and it'll tell you the tow level. So it was really handy because once this tool was sort of set up and running, I could feed in all of the profile data going back to 2003. And then what it is all of these parameters here, and I'll give you the range. So when we're modelling overtopping, we can actually see, what berm slopes, what elevations, what beach slopes, etc., have actually been observed. So when we're modelling those profiles within the overtopping tool, we can sort of have a bit of validation for these can actually exist. So, and again, this tool, all it's doing is extracting from the data. So the more data you have, the better. So again, massive nod to the monitoring program. So the more profile data we have, the better. And especially with things like the post-storm, having the profile at its best and at its worst is, again, invaluable. If you're only ever capturing data once a year, then you might be missing out one of those two. Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, so the volumetric data was used to create this long-term difference model, and then using the recycling logs. I always use natural and inverted commas because once you start managing a system, you can never really calculate what would have happened if you hadn't have done that. Whether you've put in groins, whether you've moved beach around, but you can calculate a discounted change. You can say, we surveyed this, the beach has gained 1,000 metres of material. We know that we actually moved 2,000 metres of material into that, so therefore that section has lost 1,000 cubic metres. Obviously, it's stuff most of you guys will know all that. So the Herne Bay and Whitstable, both a fairly low change. You're talking sort of maximum a couple of 1,000 cubic metres per year over the whole frontage. Obviously, when you look at the 100-year period, that can add up quite a lot. So the sort of headline figure for Herne Bay was that the annual loss over that 100-year period, when you extrapolate it out, is 30,000 cubic metres, which doesn't sound like an awful lot. If you think that means if you did a replenishment to 30,000 cubic metres, well, that's a bit more accounting for losses, then you could sort of manage that. But if you look at the actual detail, there's about 200,000 cubic metres moved within the frontage. So when you're looking at maintaining a beach as a sea defence across the whole frontage, you need to actually look at that level of detail because the headline loss figures can hide that. So that 30,000 cubic metres might need to be a replenishment, but 200,000, you're going to need to do annual or biannual recycling to compensate for that if you want to maintain a beach across the whole lot. Tool. So it wasn't, the spreadsheet tool wasn't actually developed as part of this. It was developed by Claire and myself when I was working for Canterbury a few years ago, and it came, massive kudos to Claire. So it came from the back of their MSc project. She basically put the Eurotop equations from the new Eurotop into a spreadsheet, which was a massive undertaking. And then over probably years, we slowly developed a tool so it was more user friendly, and it became sort of more and more automated. So all I've really done since, I've just added a new level of automation to it using macros, just because the level of sort of detail, as I said, 10-year epochs. For Herne Bay, I think there was something like 15 or 16 defence sections. So that 16 sections need to be modelled 10-year epochs. And the way that we did the options appraisal is we modelled sort of the defences as they are. And then we modelled the overtopping with 10 centimetre high seawall, 20 centimetre, 30, all the way up in 10 centimetre increments up to, I think it was 1.5 metres of seawall raised by year 100. So all in all, we ran just under 2 billion calculations across 2,500 spreadsheets across Herne Bay and Whitstable. And our previous method, so before Claire and I did the spreadsheet, we used to go on the Eurotop online tool, type in the wave and water levels, type in your beach slope, click run, copy that into a spreadsheet. So the data analysis we did for this plan would have taken 1,300 years of non-stop work, assuming no mistakes were made and no checking results. So it sort of shows you again, like Thomas was talking about, processes change, and if you can improve the process, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. And the reason we took this approach is it's sort of very data heavy. There's two main approaches when you're sort of doing your long-term modelling. You can try and work out what you think the sort of critical short-term probabilities of what your inputs are, and then model for that. And equally with a beach slate, you can say take your design, calculate a design beach, and then that's what you model. Or you can do this approach, which is say, well, we're not quite sure what's going to happen, so we're going to model thousands of different beach profiles, we're going to model hundreds of different seawall heights, and we're going to model hundreds of different joint return probabilities, chuck all of that in, and then you can account for some of the uncertainties as well. Modelling approach for both Whitstable and Herne is very simple because they're both fairly simple flood basins in terms of you've got the seawall as your sort of high ground, and then it feeds into just a basin that would essentially fill up a bit like a bathtub. I call it a bathtub plus because traditional bathtub flood models is you get your sort of elevation, the critical water elevation, and then you just flood anything below that level, you flood, and you can then work out your flood depths. We did a slightly more complicated system where we split it into different basins. These basins were again using more monitoring program data. They use the LiDAR data to essentially work out where do the basins sort of where is separated by higher ground. So that might be some of the roads are slightly raised, or other sort of features. And then you can see it on the map, for instance, the west of Herne Bay, there's some higher ground at about 5.4 metres ordnance datum. So what we did in the model is we said once that mini flood basin is above 5.4 metres, start to put water into the next flood basin, and then there's lots of different interactions, and then just through a few iterations, you eventually end up with what are your flood depths across that whole frontage. The reason we took the simple approach is, as I said, the sort of topography works for these systems, but there's loads of different ways of doing flood modelling, there's loads of different software out there. You're not really tied to that, but that's just what we chose to do. And then what the flood model did is it let us set the allowable overtopping rates. So in the past, we've sort of used sort of rules of thumb with overtopping, like 1 litre per metre per second is enough to put pedestrians at risk if they're on the seawall, for instance. We used, in the regional beach management plan, sort of 2015 time, we used 10 litres per metre per second as an overtopping rate that could cause flooding. But what we've done now is we've taken back a step and said, actually, is that rate actually the right rate to use? And by iteratively modelling it, you can work out the maximum overtopping each of these sections can let in before you get flooding. So what that helps us with is there's some sections that do have a slightly lower seawall stay. So that section without work is always going to have a higher overtopping rate. And you can actually tolerate that if you sort of reduce the rate in other sections. Again, massive iterations, but what you end up with is you don't have to sort of over-engineer it. You might have a slightly weak section of seawall that would cost you 10 million to raise, but if actually by doing a bit of beach management on the adjacent frontage, you can actually keep that over sort of the overall volumes low enough, you don't have to do that work. And so the next slide just shows the actual flood basin. We see most of central Herne Bay would be underwater if you had this is for the 1 in 200 year or the 0.5% annual event probability in the 100-year epoch. And yeah, then just to say, we also looked at the floodgates. So a lot of that flood water is actually some of it's overtopping, but a lot of it actually comes from if the floodgates failed or if they weren't closed. It essentially then got a section of wall, even if it's a small section, because the invert level is so low, it can let in an awful lot of water over a storm event. So that was really interesting because we sort of know it as engineers anyway. If you don't close the floodgates, you're going to get a lot of flooding, but it's quite handy to quantify it. And it helps us go to the Environment Agency with a business case specifically looking at upgrading all of our floodgates. Because a lot of the floodgates, not so much Herne Bay and Whitstable, use Green Heart. And if you've got a bit of green heart sort of this big, you can just about lift it. I have, while working at Canterbury, dropped one my toe, which was very, very stupid. I can tell you it hurts a lot. But once you sort of get up to the bigger dimensions, it's incredibly difficult to lift, even with two people. And then if you have, so they go into sort of metal frames. If that metal frame is slightly warped, you get your workman in to lift this thing, which is incredibly heavy anyway. It might be chucking down the rain, and then you find it doesn't slot in properly. That's essentially floodgate failure. So as well as actually looking at sort of invert levels of floodgate, we also looked at design. So the idea would be having either swing gates or sliding gates, gates that one person can operate and gates that are less likely to fail, essentially. Part of it is where we looked at erosion modelling. So a very simple approach was taken, which is just using the N720 rates. No sort of custom modelling was done for the plans, just because it was deemed sort of unnecessary for the cost. Whitstable has no erosion risk. And although you can see from the lines, it does look quite significant by year 100, but the number of properties is still sort of, compared to the flood damages, it's still fairly low. I think they account for something like 5% or 10% of the overall damages or erosion damages. But spending an awful lot of money modelling erosion to the nth degree wouldn't make sense. And it does sort of correlate, all right, the N7 rates are actually lower than a previous study done at Herne Bay, but that previous study done at Herne Bay was quite old, and I think the rates in that were a little bit suspect. We actually went for the lower erosion rate, which gave a slightly less cost benefit, but we think was a bit sort of more realistic, and meant we weren't overcounting benefits. So standard protection. So based on all of this input, so the end game is not getting erosion, not getting flooding. And sorry, the one thing I should have noted with erosion, with the erosion frontages, the failure mechanism was still determined by overtopping, but we had an overtopping rate that we think would cause seawall failure. And obviously once the seawall fails, then it can start to open up into erosion. So each beach profile essentially now has a cross-section of beach that it needs to be for the standard protection. And again, you can't really see the map so well. We essentially analysed if you did no work at all today, what would the standard protection be? And across the sort of west of Herne Bay, in the erosion area, it's pretty high, close to 1,200. But as you get to the east, certainly what we call section H, which is actually sort of just west of where we are now, there's a sloped concrete apron, and because of that, there's smaller groins. You can't really hold a very big beach there. And the standard of protection is as low as 1 in 1 year, which sounds very dramatic. Introducing a small amount of beach there massively increases the standard of protection, but it just demonstrates that there are sort of critical places, and also demonstrates the fact that you need to do beach recycling and sort of other maintenance type activities are actually crucial, even with your big assets. If the whole system isn't set up, then you can sort of fail. So as I already said, so we ran the overtop with 10 centimetre increments of seawall. And then from this, we basically work out at these 10-year epochs what you can do. So you could raise the wall, you could have a bigger beach. And again, it's sort of fairly iterative, because when you're modelling overtopping based on a beach and a seawall, if you raise your seawall, overtopping goes down. If you make your beach bigger, overtopping goes down. So from sort of based on different options, we came up with 7 shortlisted options, and some of those favoured beach management as sort of the primary risk reduction method. Some of them favoured seawall raising, and some of them were sort of slightly extreme, and when that happens, the improved option looks at, okay, well, why don't we defend a whole 100-year period by doing a scheme today, which for Herne Bay would have meant groins probably bigger than the King's Hall and a massive beach replenishment. Couldn't make it north. Right back at the start, we wanted it to be adaptable, so we didn't want to do an option that ties us down for the whole 100 years. So the ideal option is always beach management. You can get away with just beach management perfect. If you need sort of modest seawall raising, you sort of look pragmatically at how you might do that. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to raise the seawalls all at once. And there's a few different construction types as well. So when you're I don't think we're doing this either. But maybe potentially we might, some of the seawalls in Herne Bay, that lovely sort of yellow brick with a capping stone, that's fairly simple to sort of lift off the capping stone, add a few courses of brick to put it back on. But other seawall types where you've got a precast unit with a recurve on it, you could put more concrete on top, but then you've sort of lost that recurve. So you're looking more at, do you need to actually replace it? So yeah, with Lee and the CCC engineering, basically look pragmatically at what sort of the preferred options would be. And obviously with the modelling, we just ensure that those options would actually manage that risk. And this graph just shows you the level of seawall raising per section over the 100-year epoch. So the sort of different defect sections are across the x-axis, and the different lines of those 10-year epochs. For the bigger lines are 100-year. See that it's not fully consistent, but mostly we're looking at about a metre of sea level rise. This is in conjunction with beach management as well. But some of the sections were actually, so there's one called section F, which is within the breakwater. You actually only need to raise the seawall by about 20 centimetres there, because we're looking at an option in essentially to cut off more wave angles. So it gets to the stage where actually the waves coming in are so small, you don't need much for seawall at that point. But we didn't look at sort of extending that breakwater across the whole of Herne Bay, because off-water revetments are so amazingly expensive that the cost benefit just wasn't there for anything too dramatic. Yeah, and these maps just show you the sort of the beach side of things. So the graph is the same setup, but instead of seawall rising, that just shows you the cross section of beach. And the black lines are from the historic record from the monitoring programme, and the purple lines, if you can see it, was the current day, which was 2022 for when we were doing the analysis. So you can see that the beach you sort of need over that 100-year period. And nearly every section, it is sort of the size of beach you've had historically is the size of beach you'll need in future, which is quite good. That's not always the case. But by sort of putting the effort into that, modelling all of these different cross sections and things, you can sort of not prove, because it's all based on the best available data we have. But you can demonstrate actually you don't need a drastically bigger beach. You just need to actually manage that. So going back to before, you just need to make sure the shingle is where it needs to be. So if it's eroding from one area to the next, you just need to take it back, which was sort of good news for Herne Bay. And you might be able to just like see on the works map. So the blue area is the bays where you need more beach material in the current day. And then the rock revetment. So the breakwater is sort of Neptune car park. There's a basic breakwater that goes along that car park and stretches around. And then just to the west of that, there's a rock groin, which is currently just perpendicular to the coast. But we looked at, with very sort of outline modelling, just adding a little curve, fully close off breakwater. So it wouldn't be an enclosed harbour, which was actually looked at by the council some years ago. But you would actually, just by adding about 20 metres of rock to the end of that, you actually cut out enough of the critical wave angles that what gets through then wouldn't cause the damaging overtopping. But really sort of good to know that with fairly modest rock work, you can actually defend that whole breakwater with a much higher standard than it currently is. And it also means at the moment lots of recycling happens within that bay. Whereas once we added that little curve to the rock groin, the recycling is going to go down to, well, I wouldn't say nothing, but it'll be very, very low. So an outline of the results. So this is aggregated across Herne Bay and Whitstable. There's about 3,000 residential, 500 non-residential properties within that 100 or 200-year floodplain by the 100-year epoch. And there's a further 246 residential, 18 non-residential at risk of erosion within Herne Bay. The PD damages, for those who don't talk Environment Agency business case talk, that's the present value damages, so essentially accounting for inflation over the 100-year period. If you did no work at all, so no beach management, no seawall raising, no maintenance, you're not closing the floodgates, the damages would be around £900 million, of which, so of 600,000 of that is Whitstable. About 600 million is in Whitstable, and 300 million is in Herne Bay. And the reason Whitstable is so much bigger is just because the flood basin is more condensed than Whitstable. You've got similar sizes of physical floodplain, but far more houses than Whitstable. And our chosen option is what we've called Adapt B, which is slightly better than Adapt A. And it's predicted to cost around £20 million in Whitstable. This is over the 100-year period. And about £23 million at Herne Bay. Herne Bay was more expensive just because you've got that rock groin work, and there's another rock groin we want to construct. That stuff just tends to be more expensive. And a lot of the work in Herne Bay is in the shorter term, whereas Whitstable, it's sort of iterative work over the 100-year period. If you're doing a big scheme in 100 years' time, the present value costs are very low. Whereas if we're doing a lot of work now, the present value costs are very high. And the benefit cost ratios are around 34:1 for Whitstable and 13:1 in Herne Bay. So that means, based on all of the assumptions of the modelling, if you spend £1 of flood defence grant money, you'd expect around £34 of benefit. Yeah, so next steps, one of the big ones for me is that the joint return probability, so there's a whole application I'm not going to go into about joint return probabilities versus multivariates and all these other methods. But to optimize simple mind, because joint return probabilities are fairly simple and straightforward, some more complex methods, we've got data to back them up. I think there's still a case for using them. However, we're still working off a 2012 data set, which Channel Coast did for us to inform the regional beach management plans. So we're using that 2012 study and essentially extrapolating it to current day with climate change. And it's getting to the stage where that's a bit unreasonable. So one of the big things going forward is to look to update that study to current day. Obviously, we've got sort of 10 years more data on top of that to help validate as well. Improving tools, going back to what Thomas was saying, constantly improving our processes. For both the overtopping and the analysis tools, there's always scope for improving those. Sort of the automation route can be good, but also you need, with the automation route, you need to make sure you're doing even more checking, because what you don't want to do is just trust what your spreadsheet's saying or trust what your MATLAB script's saying. So I guess there's probably a trade-off. If you can spend a lot less time doing the analysis, getting the data, you can then spend more time with qualified people checking the outputs, which is probably the way I want to go. And yeah, as I hope I've got across, the monitoring data is absolutely invaluable to the sort of the whole process of creating this strategy. But yeah, the one note is it's essential to have the data sort of in a timely fashion. So for studies like this, it's good to have the most up-to-date data, but certainly when you go on to actually managing your beaches, the quicker you can get the data, the better it is, essentially. So I guess what I'm saying there is that it'll be great to have the current monitoring data on the website sort of as soon as possible, because then it's really, really useful. You don't have to sort of chase the local authorities independently. But that's, yeah, the only bit of feedback I can offer. And then, yeah, higher resolution data can be more cumbersome. The sort of large data size. So I was working with one drone survey that I had to essentially now, the good thing about being independent, not the council, is I'm not so limited by IT, but it's still just scanning around the map is, you know, it can take sort of minutes and minutes to load. But for analysis, it can add a lot of value. So I think there's always a trade-off between getting really, really detailed data and a lot of it, actually having usable stuff. So that's again where that sort of pragmatism comes in. Put the effort in where you need the effort, and then use slightly simpler methods where you can get away with simpler methods. But again, the coastal monitoring is absolutely invaluable. And that 3D data I was very excited about. So again, having that high resolution data can be really, really handy for this stuff. So yeah, big thanks to the monitoring programme. Thanks to Liam, and I think that's it for us.
Well, thank you to Simon, for Liam, and to Andy for that comprehensive presentation. Certainly very, very interesting to hear about the assets and adaptation plans. So surely that must have got some questions from people now. So we've got about 20 minutes now for questions, if anyone has any questions. Oh,
First question for Simon. You talked about you had conversations with fishing communities. How did that go? How did you facilitate that?
do you want to come up?
Sorry.
Yeah,
So the question was essentially, you talked about engaging with fishing communities around sort of Dungeness area. How did you go about that?
So it was managed externally for us by a consultant, but yes, essentially we knew who the fishermen were. Chap who was their designated leader, as it were. So we had one point of contact, and the estates team then dealt with any compensation claims. So they would insist upon seeing, obviously, at due diligence, their accounts to prove that they would receive an income from that area, and that the amount of compensation was appropriate.
Okay. Was there an IFCO involved?
Was there, sorry?
Was there an IFCO involved?
An IFCA?
They sort of represent fisheries groups, but
No, not as far as I'm aware. It's done very locally.
okay.
It was only involved only about 6 actual fishermen.
Okay.
They're all, I might have seen on the slide, they actually haul their boats out there.
Yeah.
So it's very, very low touch, really.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Cool. Thanks very much.
I think it was just, it was a fisheries liaison officer. They created a sort of a spokesman, didn't they, from the fishing community? But,
Yeah, it was the local guy, wasn't it?
yeah. But it was very local.
Yeah, and it wasn't contentious, to be honest. You know, they was very supportive of the works. It might be different if you had fishermen from a different part of the coast who were fishing that area, but because it was quite close to shore, it didn't impact a lot of fishing communities, to be honest.
Good.
So, well, I've got lots of hands now. I'll go with Simon.
I'm just interested in your chem-free C30 poultry.
Oh, yes.
Actually links in the monitoring. But to see.
But there was also they used some of it at New Haven. You recall? It was in New Haven, I believe, which is a more in a sort of a scientific environment, so they can test its performance more accurately. And there is another system which we're using at Lid, which is a different product, which has been a bit more user friendly. I can't remember what it's called, unfortunately, but we can find out if you're interested.
Yeah, that's just. We've also actually picked up on the asset register in terms of condition. So if you're obviously monitoring the asset, you'll also monitor the condition.
It will be monitored in terms of the asset performance, not particularly as an alternative technology. That will be done by the project team over time.
Is it something that can potentially sort of be included in the asset data, just in a condition?
I don't know, to be honest. Not something I thought of. It could be, I guess. But we need to steer from national on that. That's not something we would decide to do locally, I don't think. Interesting thing for me was the rebar. I think of all of the advances, because obviously there's a big carbon footprint to steel reinforcement. And this stuff it's like a carbon product. It's incredibly lightweight, but that people had great hopes for that. That performed really well. So obviously the two in combination, a profound saving. It's not appropriate for everywhere though, because it's quite slow curing. So if you can't add accelerant to account for an incoming tide, for instance, it has to be outside the tidal range, unless you're using the precast units. Of course, that's the next big thing. If the industry can take that forward, then that would be a real bonus to everyone, really. Particularly when you've got precast step directness or things like that. That'd be really good.
Also long-term maintenance in the environment.
Yeah. Somewhere. So where I was working on it, so it was trench fill, where it could cure over time. So it's not a panacea. You can't use it everywhere at the moment. But of course, the product is developing at the time. It's very novel. The other sort of restriction for it is it's so the availability is so limited. You have to order it in bulk. You have to order a mixer load full of it.
Right.
More than that, actually, you have to contractually be obliged to buy more. And when they deliver it, nobody else is going to use it. So if you're not using it, the rest goes to waste. But they're problems that will be overcome over time, I'm sure.
And is it actually used in any sort of coastal, like direct dynamic environment?
This was literally the first time it's been used, so we're using it as well for a haul road. So similar sort of application.
So it's very much back, but it's not actually dynamically in the sea.
No, it's not.
No,
No.
Direct.
No, that'll be the next step.
Yeah.
But the curing time is the problem. And the workability. So the first products, you pour it into your formwork, and as you tamper it to try and form the surface, and it separates from the water, so the water comes to the surface, and you lost any possibility of working it. You have to essentially work it very quickly. So the guys learned to use it, but obviously it's limited, and you don't get a very pleasing finish. And it didn't look as good to the eye as a traditional cement-based concrete would. But the new product was a bit better. Still long curing time, but it was more workable. So it's obviously
some way away from something like the church and market.
Yeah, I think so. But it needs that impetus. It needs people to experiment with it. We're trying to do that, but others need to pick up the baton on various schemes and what have you. As I say, they're really useful. The industry that produces the precast units can embrace it and experiment with it. So,
Yeah, many questions. Sorry.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Also, the last one, was there any requirement on machines to have a screen at all?
Yeah, so the problem is, as you know now, that obtaining clean shingle is a challenge. So where they're harvesting from, it's got a lot of fines in it. So the Vauxhall Media had a sieve, to grade it, which is fine. It adds considerably to the cost, and it's not great for the environment. It's resource hungry. The sieve itself is a massive unit. It's just about 20 metres wide, square possibly. So quite big. Obviously, it's got to be fabricated. It's got a very short life. At the end of the scheme, it's knackered, so you have to dispose of it. So it is a problem, and particularly if the sediment grading curve is quite onerous. I think we was allowed 10% fines, which is quite tough.
Did you say what area did you say?
Sorry?
What area did you ask? What was it?
I think it was near the Channel Islands. Do you recall? I'm pretty sure it's near the Channel Islands, somewhere there. It's an area that TDI have licensed for. But it's a struggle now to find these areas with the clean shingle.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Question for Andy. You talked about using the LiDAR data to form the basis of the flood model. How did you do that?
So you essentially use the LiDAR data for the topographic that fed into the flood model. So actually flood modeled, although I said I did that spreadsheet approach, we used the 1 meter resolution to sort of inform where the flood basin was.
So that was just a drawing on LiDAR exercise, or was there something else sitting?
I know. So actually, sorry. So with those sub basins, it's basically in GIS, just drew the sub basins, use the LiDAR data to actually extract the volume for each 10 centimetre increment of water level. Basically extracted the volume of water that basin would hold, and that calculation came from the LiDAR data.
Okay.
So then, yeah, because then when it went into the spreadsheet model, then you have, if the water elevation is 4.1 metres ordnance datum, you can have 100,000 cubic metres of water. If it's this, then you can have this. Now that's a very quick, simple relationship between volume and elevation.
And the trim probabilities you used the 2012 CCR trim probabilities that were calculated then.
Yes, yeah. So we use the 2012 data set and then just updated for climate change to bring it to current day.
Fair enough. With the joint probe, you talked about multivariates. The EA is updating its guidance on multivariate analysis. They've contracted JBA to deliver that updated guidance. Don't remember the timeline off the top of my head, but in the next year or year and a half, 2 years or so, that updated guidance will come out. So might be worth exploring it once that guidance is out?
Yeah, definitely. As I think there's a discussion to be had on sort of going forward, especially having consistency along the coast. Everyone's doing different things. So the High Ranges scheme, so I had the benefit of doing a little sense check of what they had done, and they actually used the state of the nation. But then what they eventually did is just went back to using single joint return probability. And then there's other people doing different things. Sometimes modelling the same flood basin with slightly different data sets. So yeah, I think there's definitely a big conversation to be had around some consistency, and then obviously driving up the standards that we're all working to.
CCO is part of the steering group for that guidance. So if you have any feedback in terms of what you would like to see as a practitioner from that guidance, I'd be very, very interested in hearing that.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Oh,
Sorry, I mean, just into flood basins, do you take into consideration the cost of stream?
In a word, no. So yeah, if obviously if you're doing more complicated flood modelling, you would, and it's a limitation. I think because the overall method was fairly broad brush, and as I said, a fairly simple flood basin, the level of detail was fairly low because essentially the volumes of seawater coming in, some of that detail didn't matter so much. If it makes sense, whether you drain into a certain capacity, it was certainly be overwhelmed. I think it's a good nod to say that with flood modelling accounting for that stuff is really important.
I was just intrigued with some of the interesting way that the we actually look at these in isolation with obviously coastal overtopping, the blue events taking some of the headlines. If you're looking at those sort of 10-year increments, what benefits you get from possibly improving some of your relevant drainage as well as in conjunction with beach management. It's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a massive thing, isn't it? I guess the problem often is there's an expertise gap between the different disciplines, and there's the management gap with the county councils doing drainage and then the local authorities and the EA doing Adaptation. Yeah, it's a good plug to say that we should be working together a lot more effectively.
Yeah, really right.
What successful plans for Langhorne Bay? Is there any plans for any other frontages coming up?
Yeah, I've got some business cards about it. So we are actually looking with doing one of the sort of Beal and Kingsdown frontages. I think it'll be great to work with as many people as we can to essentially hone the methodology and then have a bit more consistency across the southeast. I mean, eventually consistency across the country would be great. But at the moment, it's Deals next, and then I guess then it's sort of plugging the gaps of the smaller flood basins. So it can be things like Swale Cliff. That's not as glamorous as Whitstable, a lot smaller, but obviously if you can look at it in a more detailed and more pragmatic way, that's good.
any other questions from anyone? The online? No. Brilliant. Oh, lovely. I'd just like to thank all this morning's speakers. So if we could just give them a round of applause. Nicely out to lunch. So we've got an hour now for lunch, and we'll be back at 2:00.
Yep, good.
So welcome back to this afternoon session. I'm just going to introduce the Harrison, who's head of Heritage Private. He's going to be talking about the discovery and excavation of the Tankerton Beach. Then we'll have a presentation from Andrew later, which is recorded. Dungeness. And then Dominic Townsend is going to be talking about sand and gravel beach water dynamics. So I'd like to hand over to Mark.
Thanks, mate. So I've got a range of titles. The two I'm going to use today are Director of Research for Timescales Kent, so we're a community archaeology group based in Whitstable. And I'm also a research fellow in the Centre for Heritage at the University of Kent. My students, something that COVID couldn't do, which for an intertidal archaeologist who's used to eating mud, which is the best antibiotic, I have a cold. So I will struggle through. So this journey actually started when I was 12 years old in the reference library in Whitstable. And it was a locked room, and you had to ask the librarian if you could go in, but you had to have an adult with you to go into this glass cabinet where there was a book called Whitstable, Swalcliffe and Sea Salter. And in the middle of the book, it had this black and white photograph of this plat, of this strip man. What Goodsall, the author, didn't say was it was 26 feet long. And it went from North Foreland all the way to Faversham and showed the southeast side of the Isle of Sheppey. And it was in full colour. Now, I didn't get to see that plat in real life until 2018. And it is amazing. And 8 metres long. The colours are dynamic. And it's actually titled, next slide please, A Project for a Barrier of Ships at the Mouth of the Swale. It's anonymous, there's no date on it. It's between dates, sort of 1514, 1520, 1530. It's certainly Henry VIII. And I think over the years, the barricade has been interpreted as those black features that you see there. But it actually refers to an anchorage further down the swale, where if you put a few ships there, you've actually blocked the swale. Those are actually fish traps. And in this part of the country, and over on the other side of the estuary in Essex, they're known as giddles. So they're stationary fish traps. Next slide, please. Now, of course, Whitstable, Sea Salter, Faversham has based its economy over the last few hundred years around shellfish cultivation, in particular oysters. And this map was drawn in 1865 during a boundary dispute between the 3 companies. And in the 1970s, it all got very exciting for an aspiring young archaeologist, because my friend Tom Porter, who we would describe as a longshoreman, found a dugout canoe on the intertidal area at Sea Salter. Next slide. But they were quite busy just down the road on the Sea Salter marsh, excavating what is now known as the Gravely Boat. Valerie Fennick was the director there. She's still about. And they said to Tom, we're quite busy at the moment. It'll be fine. But Tom wasn't so confident. And fortunately for us, he took a sample of wood. Died before the carbon date was done in 1984. And it dates to somewhere around the 2nd and 3rd century AD. So Romano-British. It was massive news in Whitstable, as was the Gravely Boat. Next one, please. So I started walking up and down the mud at every low tide. I didn't go to school very much. But this little wreck here is known as Old Smack. And the folklore is it's the smack that actually captured James II when he was trying to flee to France. I think it might be that the smack was part of the fleet that saw him being captured. But anyway, if it is around about 1650. So in the archives at Maidstone, Kent Archives at Maidstone, we found a land holding, terrier I suppose you would call it, that shows incredible sort of Civil War period ships and boats. A wreck is one of those. And Dan Sherrin, who was a rather eccentric artist, painted the smack in 1901. Whether it was that intact, we're not sure. Dan was rather, how can we say, flamboyant and impressionistic. But anyway, it's still there. But the coastal processes mean she's breaking up. Next one, please. And in Goodsall's book, he mentions his friend Wallace Harvey, an antiquarian, and his friend Brian Porter excavating a ship at Sea Salter that was known as Old Brig. Now, as we know, brigs are twin-masted vessels. So they set about trying to find the two mast steps, but they didn't find them. They pulled off a few artifacts, blocks and tackles, a few bits of ceramics, but they left it. So we went back in 2019. Next one. 5 volunteers, Historic England and Wessex Archaeology, and finished the job. It's not a brig, it's a single-masted hoy or humber keel, which in Kent is known as a brig. That vessel is now scheduled, not because she is Hanoverian, she dates to around about 1720, but because she's the only known surviving smuggler. And in 1996, we had tidal surge along this section of coast, and it stripped all of the sheathing overburden that tank. Every single stone went, and it showed the archaeology and the geology underneath, the London clay, and huge areas of pollution that have been caused that converted iron pyrite fossils into a product called green vitriol, which was a mordant for dyes and fixing inks. And we had all kinds of posts and structures revealed. So we carried on our walkover survey. Next one. And we found this tantalising oval. Now, in my field notes, it says oval feature. I don't know too much about ships and boats, but I put 17th century, question mark. By the time we went back, we had another storm, and she'd been covered up again. Next one, please. But to be honest with you, I didn't know at that stage who to call. So in 2009, we were working on a project called the Forgotten Frontline, which was recording the extant World War II defence works and fortifications between Sea Salter and Herne Bay. This was to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War. During that research, we came across a number of maps that showed where all the defence works were. This one was commissioned by the regular army, asking the Home Guard in the area to record the structures on their patrol records. It shows concrete pillboxes, barbed wire, anti-tank invasion barriers, flame warfare positions. Next one. And of course, getting into the photographic archives at the Kent Messenger Group, this, along with about 20 other photographs that they couldn't identify. They couldn't identify the location. So the box just said WW2 Gash. We were able to identify all those. This is at Sea Salter. And this is an obstacle called Admiralty Beach Obstacle Z1. It was supposed to slow down landing craft. 15,000 miles of tubular scaffolding was purchased. And from the 1946 aerial survey, we were able to see the demolition sites. Next one. there marked where the oval feature is. Next one, please. So in 2017, we were doing a walkover survey looking for lumps of concrete that had been expelled from the defence works as part of the demolition process. The guy that didn't know how to use dynamite, so he used too much. So these bits of concrete were going 70 to 80 metres, and sitting in the middle of the oval feature was a lump of concrete. Next one, please. So we pulled together a group of volunteers using highly sophisticated techniques to measure how big it was. And of course, with FaceTime now, we were able to reach out to Mark Dunkley and Paul Jeffrey at Historic England. And within 2 weeks, they were down at the site. Tom? So there's a little red star. So going back to that plat with the strip map, that's where the Tankerton Wreck would be located. Next one. Now then, looking at small archive that we found in Whitstable Museum, early 20th century, this is what Swalcliffe Tankerton coastline looked like. It was just bare cliffs. Next one. So this is Richard Cavendish, 1544. Cavendish was a gunner and massive landowner in Suffolk, and he drew a map of the southern North Sea in the Thames estuary. And there, again, I've just inverted that, did the same alignment as the strip map. This is Richard Porter, 40 years later. Porter was a naval constable. And I'd be very interested in your view as to what the black dots are and what the red dots are. Is it mean low tide, mean high tide? Is it areas that are not covered by any tide at all? That's quite an impressive set of sandbags, isn't it? Next one, please. And this feature is shown on the strip map, covered in fish traps. It's known locally as the street. There's been a lot of research done on it as to whether it's a natural feature or whether it's semi-engineered. It's probably a little bit of both. Certainly over the last 30 years, it's not as long as it used to be. And it's shown on naval charts from the 18th century. (1794). There's the wreck. From the north looking south. So as part of the research, we found this chart in the Canterbury Cathedral archive, and it's another oyster boundary dispute map, 1725. You can see the cuprous area on the top left-hand corner. Our wreck could be just about there. Next one. Next one. Okay. So, obviously, Historic England were quite excited, and within a few weeks, dendrochronologists and archaeologists down at Tankerton. Quite a big team, volunteers and professionals. And we did 2 years' worth of excavation. It was pretty sticky, it was very hot. So what did we find out? Well, she's a Cargill-built single-masted merchant ship, around about 100 to 200 tons, so 150 tons, which for this period, if we're saying we should have built them around about 30, the average vessel in the Whitstable area was around about less than 40 tons. Most of them were 15 tons. So what was this vessel doing in this end? And as I said, 16th to 17th century. Next one. Once it has gone, what we've got here is, I would suggest, what couldn't have been rolled out. How she came to shore, we're not sure. My personal view is I think she was worn out and had just been brought in and sat on a salt marsh over the years, and people had taken away bits and pieces from her. Next one. Ailing of Lord Beal from Lampeter, outstanding. And they've given us a stunning date of 1531. So round about contemporary with Mary Rose. Timbers were from across Northern Europe. Next one. Drone pilot Tom, was amazing. Finds were limited but exquisite. Leather shoes, adult size 2. A funicular suit. Anybody know funicular? Apparently it's the shape of a fig in the bowl. Cod bones, tackle bones, and galley bricks and porking moss. We've left the galley area intact. There's about 2 meters of anoxic silt there, which means there's very high potential for environmental evidence there. We've left that intact for the time being. Weather was amazing. We got up at 3 a.m, did 4 hours, went home, had a sleep, and then came back in the evening and did another session. Apparently, it was reaching the working time directors. What do you think Tankerton Beach Wreck looked like? Probably like this herring bush on the left hand. What do we think that the old brig looked like? Probably that point on the right hand side. That's drawn by a young artist I work with, Annabella. And both wrecks seem so important. They've both been scheduled as Scheduled H monuments. And of course, Southampton University, Thomas, commissioned by Anthony Firth, my colleague, to do some monitoring of the site. What did you find?
We didn't do any monitoring at the site, but we did test whether our coastal monitoring data could inform on sort of managing and monitoring the heritage asset going forward. I'm actually hand over to Will because Will's the lead author. Right, Will. Tankerton, you remember it?
Now it looks like we weren't the first people to excavate the Tankerton Beach Wreck. 2 years after we'd done our final excavation, I found this article on the British Newspaper Archive, which says that a person digging for cement stones, so these are like hard phosphatic nodules in the London clay, struck a shovel against a piece of timber, and on digging deeper into the beach, it appeared to form part of the vessel's beam. Here's the important 12 and 17 feet broad. That's exactly the same measurements as we've had. Now, clearly, I'd like it to be another vessel, but if it's this one, great. It really does explain why we've got so little of it left. Next one. And at the same time, we found this record in the Canterbury Cathedral Archive, 1377, shipwreck at Seasalter. The Queen from Zealand, modern Netherlands. It's there somewhere. So this area's got very high potential for other shipwrecks, other structures, but probably now denuded. So that means that any research we do is going to have to be done remotely with underwater devices. Next one. And in terms of our community outreach, we always turn our work into things that are accessible. So this one was done by myself and cartoonist called Dave Chisholm. Next one. Dave and I also did a strip map of our own for the defence works between Sea Salter and Tankerton. And just to show that that plat saying you can block the swale with ships, well, in 1797, the Defence of Britain plan showed that if you block the swale at Shellness, you actually prevent any enemy going around the south side of the island. You protect the gunpowder works at Faversham, and it only takes one vessel. And this is something we put during the pandemic, actually. Next one. Wow, that's a good time. You've got that.
I'll take questions at the end as well. Three questions.
I'd like to go, please. I'm not very well.
That's fine.
Any questions from Mark?
Thomas.
How did you find working in the mud as an excavation? How did you deal with that?
This is something I had to take serious account of because as someone that had been doing it for a long time, I was used to it. With my other volunteers, we had to make sure they had plenty of water, they had barrier creams, they had all kinds of other safety devices and taking regular breaks. So the risk assessment was very detailed. And of course with heat.
Stable footing enough to actually do the works.
We assessed each volunteer to see which areas they could work in. Some were assessed not to be able to work on the site itself, could only work on the shore and acted as stewards. So when people were coming by, they were explaining things, so nobody was excluded.
Very good.
Not yet, no, but be very interested. I think the street stones presents a very high potential, for structures. From the medieval records, it shows that there was probably a large beacon on the end, and probably collecting a tax. Certainly in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century, they were charging a tax to be piloted through the street stones, sixpence. I'm sure that went back further back.
How much work were you having to redo after every cycle, or did the system not move that much?
Yeah. What we found out very quickly, like Jaws, we didn't have a big enough pump. And we should have invested more in the pump and finding ways to coffer the site. We were wasting a lot of time. So we've learnt that now. And certainly we'd be looking for like a fire service type pump to clear the site very quickly to get back into the archaeology.
Any other questions in the mark?
Did you cover it at all? Yeah. Did you cover the site at all?
We did a little bit, probably about 30 centimetres. And we picked this up from the old boy fishermen, who were sort of bait diggers. And they said, if you just do this, you'll be surprised how much you can. Tide had gone out, which is quite good, but we still didn't have a big enough part. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, so our next presentation is going to be from Andy Plater. This is a recording, which I believe hopefully well.
Hello everybody, thanks for this opportunity to present to the Southeast RCMP annual partners meeting. I'm Andy Plater. I'm going to focus on research that I've undertaken on Dungeness Foreland and the contiguous back barrier marshland of Romney Marsh. I think the insights that we get from this work is incredibly valuable for considering future coastal management options, about not necessarily maintaining the shoreline as it is now, but what would be the art of the possible to a large extent there. So we'll start with a view of some past configurations, giving us the conditions of the dynamics of Dungeness and Romney Marsh, giving us a perspective of what might be possible in terms of future coastal management options, not necessarily maintaining the coast as it is now, but how we might be able to maintain it in a different state going forward, which aligns with what it's gone through in the past. So the insights relate to the long-term coastal evolution as a consequence of sea level rise and changes in sediment supply, response to individual events such as storm surges, which have breached the shoreline at different times. What I've regarded as alternative stable states. I don't know whether that's suitable use of that terminology, but having these different configurations and knowing that they lasted for some time, perhaps that's the kind of coastline that we could move towards in relation to a future option. But importantly, this is providing us with some insights into some of the conditions, the settings and the dynamics which promote a resilient coastline, not a resistant coastline, but one that can respond to shocks after disturbance, and significant disturbance in the case of the Foreland breaching, the southern shoreline breaching. So we've got an interesting situation here, which is, I think, it can be relatively common in terms of having a high energy wave dominated shoreline, which has very different dynamics to what sits behind it in relation to a low energy tide dominated system. So how have these two different environments interplayed through time? Well, the first insights to that can readily be gained by looking at the sediment record. This shows transects across Romney Marsh and continuing into Dungeness, showing us that back barrier marsh stratigraphy, how that's been crossed by channels at various times and in various locations, and how it then butts up against and interleaves with the immediate barrier environment. So there's lots of information in here which I'll go through, as well as information from the Foreland itself. So perhaps we'll just start there in relation to the information from coring the Foreland, largely based on a chronology which has been determined using optically stimulated luminescence. So this slide shows the locations of cores of which have been sunk through the Foreland. Again, using, in this case, contractual drilling, because it's a pretty difficult environment to core, not just because of the grain size, but because of the groundwater. So it's not necessarily something that I've been keen to tackle myself because of the complexities of it, but certainly back barrier marshland stratigraphy all over that. So from the sediment record here, we can see that the gravel Foreland sits on top of a large prism of sand, which is this sandy shore face, and the ages which have been determined at the time had to focus on the sandy deposits. Through the current gravel beach project, we're actually going to be focusing on dating gravel, not from Dungeness sadly, but it just shows how technology and dating methodology as it moves on, we could perhaps get information from other parts of the sediment record. But here these are ages which have been determined using that luminescent chronology, that shows how the underlying shore face has provided a platform upon which the gravel Foreland has built. And we can see that from these, almost like these sigmoidal lines that join points of equal age, what we call isochrons, we can see how that shore face has built out through time over a period of about 5,000 years to about 600 years before present. So if we look at the insights from the OSL chronology, those sigmoidal isochrons give us some idea of the configuration and the interfacing between the shore face pre-existing, I suppose, subtidal, maybe intertidal flat as a precursor for the development of the foreland. We've got a timing for that progradation of the foreland between 500 and 400 years before present. If we look at the spacing between those isochrons, we've got to be careful how we interpret that, because we assume that the cores have been taken parallel to the direction of foreland progradation, which might not be the case. So we can say that there's been that gradual eastward extension of that subgravel sand. There appears to be an increase in spacing between the isochrons when we get to about 2,000 years before present, and a second increase again after about 1,300. So these could be real increases in progradation rate, or they could be a better alignment of the sampling direction in relation to the direction of progradation. So just a bit of a caveat in terms of how to interpret that isochron spacing. Now we have also explored not just the geomorphology and the age of deposits which are at the coastline. We've also explored what exists on the sea bed immediately offshore, not just immediately offshore, but offshore in the floor of the English Channel. And here we can find, I guess it's putative evidence, but of former barrier complexes or former barrier systems which appear to have been drowned. Not everybody agrees on this one, and maybe some of your members are less convinced by this hypothesis. But the fact that if these drowned barriers, if these gravel accumulations are indeed former configurations of systems like Dungeness, then they provide us with even longer term insight, and perhaps how conditions may have caused drowning of the barrier rather than its dynamic movement shoreward as a result of sea level rise. So I suppose that the options that we have here, as some of you are obviously very familiar with, is if the forcing is able to overcome barrier inertia. Let's say sea level rise is slow and progressive enough, and the wave energy is sufficient to entrain the material that the barrier is made up of, then that gravel barrier would roll forward or roll over as sea level rose onto the shoreline. Now think about that in terms of managing that response as a result of future sea level rise. We could rely on that barrier being in place. Now the other responses, there's just subtle difference between those, but this is what we've interpreted from that offshore record. But if we find features which are found on the sea floor, and then also those at the coastline, then perhaps these features have been overstepped. Perhaps the conditions when sea level rose, maybe sea level rise was fast, or alternatively the wave energy wasn't sufficient to entrain those sediments at the time, and so therefore we get overstepping and drowning of these features in place. Now it's not just on the English Channel where we see these drowned systems, we find them in other parts of the world as well. And if we look at the ages of them, these are all about, this is a plot of the elevation of such features against their determined age. We can see a concentration of ages around this time period in the early to the mid-Holocene. And of course, this period of about 8.2 thousand years ago, the 8.2 event as it's known, was a rapid increase in sea level rise. Probably in excess of the rates of sea level rise which are projected for the future. But perhaps this has given us some things to consider, to mull over in relation to accelerated sea level rise leading to the drowning of these barrier systems through overstepping, rather than the rollover that we might have experiencing during the latter part of the Holocene, where the rate of sea level rise has been a lot lower. So that's much more of a concern there in relation to barriers perhaps not responding dynamically to future sea level rise, and potentially becoming drowned features, what does that then mean in relation to the shoreline configuration? Because probably the next line in relation to Dungeness and Romney Marsh would be right back against the cliff line. So there's that's not such a good future consideration. As I mentioned earlier on, there's some interesting things to consider here in terms of the interplay between the barrier and the back barrier environment. So we've got some hypotheses to consider here, or what we have through time. Has that been a gradual coupled evolution of the barrier progradation and the back barrier marsh infilling? Has it been more of a phase of barrier progradation and then there been a switch in the conditions and the dynamics which has then led to that widespread back barrier flooding and deposition? Or has it been more pulsed or episodic in terms of its evolution? So that goes back to looking at this back barrier record and coring that to determine what insights can we gain from looking at that back barrier record, that tripartite sequence that I showed you earlier in relation to transects across the marshland. So very competent sample in this because it's muddy, but the challenge is taking orientated cores to determine the chronology using a magnetic technique known as PSV. Sorry, that was on the previous slide. So orientated cores are important because we need to look at the orientation of the magnetic field as preserved in these sediments and compare that to the record of what we know of the Earth's magnetic field inclination and declination over the longer term. So from those orientated cores, within those different locations that I've just shown you on that plot, we can see that they kind of fit in quite nicely in relation to this trend in the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field over the last, well, since it's 800 AD, so that's the last kind of like 1100 years or so. So in essence, what happens here is when those particles are deposited, they orientate themselves into the prevailing Earth's magnetic field. And surprisingly here, rather than being able to see evolution through a section of core, it appears as though each of the samples that we've taken from those cores has very similar, if not the same, inclination and declination record. So that shows us that the sediment sequence is built up quite rapidly. The nature of those sediments in the back barrier also evidence rapid increase, rapid evolution, rapid sedimentation, because they have this kind of like rhythmite pattern to them, which is interleaving layers of sand and silt, which are actually forced by the changes in the height and the velocity of the tide. So spring tides and neap tides can actually be recorded very faithfully in these rhythmite sequences. So again, that kind of a further indication of that rapid build-up over time. So if we look at the record of the thickness of individual mud and sand layers preserved within those back barrier marshland sediments, we can see that we have sequences of thickening of the mud and thinning of the sand accordingly, and then the reverse of that, thickening of the sand, thinning of the mud. And then we can see that from the particle size analysis that we've kind of like got two modes of deposition. One, which is like slow progressive settling from the tide under a neap tide condition. Another, much more of a faster flow velocity with a tail as a result of settling as that velocity wanes, which we can associate with faster, higher tides, i.e. spring tides. If we look at the power spectra of the thickening and thinning cycles within those sediments, and we compare that with the power spectra that we get from the tide from Dungeness, we can see that the power spectra of the thickening and thinning sequence pretty much matches that comes from the highest tides, maybe about the highest 8% of tides, what might be the equinoctial tides, or those that are the highest ones that occur during the year. So it's kind of not reassuring, it's reaffirming the influence of the tide on sedimentation. It's showing that it's the bigger tides that are being preserved within that rhythmite sequence. But it's also giving us this information in terms of rapid back barrier accretion. So that rapid infilling of embayments takes place around 1200 to 450 BP. We've got sedimentation rates that come out at about 20 or 30 centimetres per year. We're used to thinking of tidal sedimentation in being 2, 3, 5 millimetres per year, but this really is rapid infilling in response to the I suppose the changes in conditions which have been created by the gravel barrier. Provides that protected environment where there has been a more of a prolonged phase of infilling as that barrier gets to the end of its lifetime, I suppose. So particle size evidence and that cyclicity indicates the influence of the higher tides on deposition. So if we go back to our three hypotheses, kind of quite happy to settle on barrier progradation and then widespread back barrier flooding subsequently. And there's a lot more that I can say about that back barrier response, which includes the collapse of the wetland, leading to that extensive uppermost phase of tidal minerogenic sedimentation. Just a tiny little bit of an aside here. Many of you, or some of you, might be familiar with the project that we undertook on Dungeness as a result of the ARCOS project. But Dungeness was never a site that we were going to explore through the ARCOS project, Adaptation and Resilience of Coastal Energy. It's one that we're able to fund through another stream, the EREP funding stream, but we kind of like layered things together. I'm not saying double dipping, we kind of like looked at another site that we could bring on board. Similarly, we could do it with the impact acceleration accounts available through EPSRC. So we could spread the net by kind of like developing the methodology first of all on some sites and then expanding it to others. And I just thought that that's worth mentioning. Some work that was undertaken here through the Blue Coast project was looking at radar monitoring, and I know that Dominique's going to say a lot more about that, so I'm not going to steal a thunder. But in essence, we were looking at reconstructing digitalization elevation models of the intertidal zone using the waterline technique that's offered by CoSense or Marlan as was, by putting a radar at camber. And the main point of this was to give us up-to-date DEMs for us to then be able to run XBeach to better capture run-up hazard for different locations over a higher frequency of times. So again, I think radar will be covered probably in the next talk. I know I'm assuming a lot there, but just want to say how we applied it there in relation to not just looking at morphology, but how we could explore run-up hazard associated with those morphologies using it coupling with XBeach. The last thing that I'm going to consider, and I know that I'm tight with time here, is considering advanced the line options for the south shore of Dungeness, so sandscaping options, which we know has been a feature of the Dutch coast, now at Bacton. But having sat down with some stakeholders in the region, we designed these different interventions. Admittedly, these stakeholders didn't include EDF at the time, where they wouldn't have been terribly happy with some of these in relation to the amount of sediment that was being put in place, but worth exploring in terms of options. The work done here was coastal evolution modelling using CEM, which was undertaken by NOC and British Geological Survey. And from that CEM modelling, we were able to explore the lifetime of certain sediment interventions. These three recurves of sand and gravel that have been put in place, could see that they would have very effective lifetime over, let's say, a 25-year period, if not longer. What they would do would obviously be able to reduce erosion hazard. So if we just took the shoreline as is at the moment, the black line shows us the erosion hazard associated with that, with reduced erosion hazard, where we've got these harder interventions. And I know that's much more extensive now. The intervention, which includes all of those little recurves put in place, is shown in the red line. So we can see that the erosion hazard is significantly reduced for much of that shoreline as a result of those interventions. So lifetime and reduction in erosion hazard as being really important outcomes from this modelling. So monitoring, then moving onto modelling is something that again focuses on how that shoreline has or could respond in the future. So to bring it all together, we can obviously obtain some useful insights in relation to future coastal change from Holocene geomorphology in the sediment record, not just on the coast but offshore. Insights to the conditions and dynamics that favour shoreline resilience, looking at the drivers and responses. Understanding past disturbance response behaviours, the offshore record in terms of barrier overstepping under accelerated sea level rise, and then in terms of the paleomagnetic secular variation and rhythmic chronology, what happens in the back barrier. Radar monitoring of the beach environment giving us some underpinning of improved run-up hazard assessment, and then modelling in relation to the lifetime and erosion mitigation potential of sediment interventions. And then that other point in relation to being able to build on projects to make sure that research projects don't have a finite lifetime and then they move on. We can keep adding to those and improving understanding as a result. Okay, apologies, I've overran there, so I will stop and I will let you carry on to the next presentation and hopefully come back for some questions. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, so Andy, who's just carried out that presentation, is actually online. So if anyone has any questions regarding his presentation, he should be able to answer them. Any questions? Right. Looks like he's got away with that one. Nothing online? No. Okay. Okay then, so that draws the day to a close, and I'll just sort of make a few points, summing up of the day. So yeah, I think it's been a really, really interesting day, and I think from our first session this morning, talking about the programme, talking about the next business case that's going in, very positive that the programme is continuing for the next 5 years. Looking at the asset register, I think that is really useful to all parties, EA, local authorities. So I think that is a really good step forward, and I've learned not to moor my boat. Yeah, and then for the second session, certainly about innovation, the use of the low carbon concrete, the Hythe ranges scheme, and the carbon fibre reinforcing, and the asset and adaptation plans that Canterbury City Council are taking forward. You know, adapting to climate change going forward, and a heavy use of the regional coastal monitoring programme data going into that, which sort of comes back to what I said this morning. And then into the third session, look at the wreck site, really interesting up of Tankerton. Interesting how the wreck site has remained relatively unchanged, but how dramatic the coastline has changed from a natural to a more engineered frontage. Now the built environment was built up. So that's very interesting. And then also to see what's happening under the water at Pevensey. We often wonder what's happening to our people under the water, where it disappears to. So good to see some research there. And with the Dungeness Peninsula, well, something I've sort of been involved on and off with for 25 years. And yeah, it's a very sort of complicated peninsula. I think there's certainly some challenges there going forward in maintaining or whatever the defences may look like there in the future, probably not in their current form. But with the complications of a nuclear power station, albeit decommissioned out on the point as well, which will be there for many years. So yeah, a lot of the challenges at Dungeness, as there always has been. So yeah, just a few thoughts of the day really. I've really enjoyed it. And I'd just like to thank all the speakers for today. So I'm sure we can show in the usual way our appreciation for the speakers. And just thanks to the Channel Coast Observatory and Canterbury City Council for the day, setting the day up, and thank you for that. And I've been informed that at the back there's some bags that you can fill up with food and take home with you, because there's plenty of food still up. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.